tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
We are packing a lot into the show today, but bear with me. We're going to move right on here because this is a fascinating one. And I actually had a conversation about this with someone the other day. We were talking about this idea of wokeness, which is, I think, increasingly become only a term used by people who are criticizing wokeness. But the idea itself is one that's certainly championed by a number of institutions, incredibly by governments, by academic institutions, and many others. And the problem with it is that it is ingrained in it is this idea of identity politics and pitting groups against each other. We start to define people by their group identity rather than by their individual identity. And when you look at diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, you see they're trying to solve one problem and are ignoring, or in some cases, creating another. Our friends over at the Aristotle Foundation did what I found to be a fascinating study looking at poverty and race in Canada, and they found that most of the poor in Canada are white. So how are these people being helped by so many of the pro-inclusivity measures? The fact remains they really aren't. This study was done by Matthew Lau and David Hunt, the latter of whom is the research director for the Aristotle Foundation and joins us now. David, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Andrew.
So let me ask you first and foremost about why you decided to look into this, because race is obviously a bit of a landmine issue, especially when your thesis is, as it ultimately came out to be, that we have this problem facing white Canadians that's not really being explored.
Hey, thanks for that question, Andrew. I think actually this is in part why the Aristotle Foundation exists. Is as you said, this is a topic that perhaps others don't want to cover. And I think we're a brand new think tank, and there are issues we need to talk about because they impact everyday Canadians. And in the case of this study, it's impacting the most disadvantaged Canadians. And it's a topic that others don't want to talk about, but we got to talk about it. And the reality is, hey, who actually are the poor in Canada? And why do we have funding in this country that is based on the color of your skin? And that, in this case, leaves out the overwhelming majority of those who are poor in Canada.
So we have different programs. I mean, there are anti-racism initiatives, there are anti-Islamophobia initiatives, anti-Semitism initiatives, there are anti-poverty initiatives. Are the anti-poverty initiatives specifically targeting diverse groups instead of the poor whites that you're talking about?
Yeah, no, there will be programs that are available to many, but there are the fact that there are any, and frankly, there are a number of programs that are under the guise of anti-poverty reduction, but whether or not you qualify is not based on a financial criterion or criteria. It's based on the color of your skin. Do you fall under one of the minority categories, or in some cases, it's very specific, where it's for perhaps Indigenous only, or for that matter, Black only funding. This study, frankly, we should probably do a follow-up study where we actually go through and identify like what are all the programs. That was beyond the scope of the study. What we were looking at here was simply, okay, here's the Statistics Canada data of who is poor in Canada. And the fact that so many are being left out. Why, frankly, is there any programming that is judging people based on the color of their skin and providing poverty relief based on skin color? We think that's illiberal and frankly, un-Canadian.
Look, if you looked at raw numbers, Canada is a 70% white country. So if every group was affected by poverty equally, you'd have more impoverished white Canadians than minority Canadians. How is it proportionally, though? Are minority communities more disproportionately affected by poverty? Is that how the government justifies this imbalance?
I would assume so, because yes, like let's be real. Both, especially let's take two groups: Indigenous Canadians and Black Canadians. They are more likely to be in poverty, and that is an issue. But what's the root cause? What's the reason for that? Is race the reason why they're in poverty? And we would argue, just by looking at the data, we would say no, race is not the primary factor. Another study that we did back in October with Matthew Lau looks at income in the country. And when it comes to income, white Canadians are actually not even in the middle. There are many different ethnic groups, or what Statistics Canada calls cohorts. There are many that make more income than white Canadians. And what's interesting is when you control for education, for example, just one of many things you can control for, and just compare your Indigenous Canadians with non-Indigenous Canadians. Once education is plugged in, there's almost no differences in some areas. Like, for example, if you have a medical degree and you're Indigenous, you're going to be making more money on average than those who are not Indigenous. Same as if you have a PhD or a master's. So the causes of poverty, at least in Canada, are not based on race. Where do you live? Are you living in a metropolitan area, or do you live out in the country? That's going to affect whether or not you're in poverty and your income. Again, what's your level of education? Are you religious or not religious? There's so many different factors. What we're saying here is, even though, yes, there are particular groups that may be disproportionately in poverty, race is not the cause for that. So if we're going to solve these problems, let's not be allocating resources based on race, because we're not going to get to the root issue.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, the left uses the term intersectionality to talk about, the way that if you're a Black trans Indigenous person in a wheelchair, your experience is going to be different than if you're just a Black woman who's able-bodied and all of this. And I think there's truth to that. I mean, life is full of disadvantages and advantages, and no person has, few people have, the best optimal thing in every way of their life. I'm a white male, but I'm also overweight. And, like, for example, so it's stuff like that. And I think that what's interesting is that they don't actually look at all of these different categories and all of these different groups. One area that's often missing is urban-rural, which, as you mentioned, is hugely, hugely influential. And I think even Indigenous, if you were to take the where they live in the country factor into that, I think you'd see a lot of variety within Indigenous populations. And also education level, as you mentioned, is key as well. I mean, if you're to use the old show that people of my age are familiar with, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Well, that experience of that Black family in Beverly Hills, in Bel-Air, is going to be a heck of a lot different than some rural white working class family from northern Alberta, say.
And that's why it's critical we have these conversations. And although this study is particularly provocative, right, because we're saying, hey, there's more white people in poverty than every other ethnicity combined, but to open up this proverbial can of worms, to have these conversations in terms of, hey, if we're seeing Canadians that are falling behind, that are disadvantaged, well, of course, we want to do something about that, and that's right. But let's get at the root. So towards the end of this short study, we point to what's called the success sequence. And this was not introduced, but popularized by the Brookings Institution down in the States. And they're by no means a conservative think tank. But they popularized this concept. And what they found is in the United States, roughly 97% of Americans who finish high school, get a full-time job, get married, have kids, do it in that order, 97%, by the time they get to their 30s, they're not going to experience poverty. And poverty defined in the absolute sense, lacking the bare necessities of life. So that study was then replicated by scholars at the University of Virginia only a few years ago, looking at millennials, so our age cohort, and same thing. They replicated the study, found 97% of millennials that finished high school, then got a full-time job, then got married, had kids, did it in that order. 97% in their 30s are not in poverty. So that was then replicated in Canada. And Christopher Sarlo with the Fraser Institute replicated the study in Canada just a few years ago and found it's not 97% in Canada. It's over 99% that follow the success sequence are not in absolute poverty as adults. So is everyone going to get married? No. Is everyone going to finish high school? No. Is everyone going to have a full-time job? No. But what the big takeaway there is there's certain cultural norms that are tried and true, frankly, over the centuries. And if we put these things into practice, and from a policy perspective, if we make it easier for more people to get on that yellow brick road, so to speak, to get on that success sequence, we're going to alleviate much of the worst effects of poverty. And frankly, there'll be much fewer people in Canada in poverty if we follow things like the success sequence and whatever those norms are that feed into that.
Well, we had an op-ed from you over at True North about this, and people can read the study for themselves at the Aristotle Foundation's website, aristotlefoundation.org. David Hunt, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.